Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I never thought I'd be moving back in with my mother at 32, but after catching Jason with his coworker in our bed, I couldn't afford the rent on my own. Mom welcomed me with open arms that February afternoon, her gray hair perfectly styled as always, wearing that lavender cardigan she'd had since I was in high school. She'd converted my old room into a craft space, but she cleared it out within days, even bought new sheets with tiny blue flowers that reminded me of childhood. The divorce papers were still sitting unsigned in my purse when she handed me a small white pill that first night, saying it would help me sleep. She stood there watching until I swallowed it, her hazel eyes full of what I thought was maternal concern. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have her, how different she seemed from the controlling woman who used to check my homework 3 times every night when I was young. The pills became routine faster than I expected. 1 in the morning for anxiety, she said, 1 at night for sleep. Mom would bring them to me with chamomile tea, always in her favorite china cups with the golden rim, always exactly at 8 in the morning and 9 at night. She'd sit on the edge of my bed, smoothing my hair while I took them, telling me stories about her own divorce from Dad 20 years ago, how she wished she'd had someone to take care of her like this. Within a week, I noticed my days starting to feel strange, like watching myself through frosted glass. I'd find myself in the kitchen with no memory of walking there, or discover half-written emails to friends I couldn't recall starting. Mom said it was just the stress, that my body needed time to adjust to the medication. She even showed me the bottle once, lorazepam, prescribed by Dr. Nathaniel Morse, though, when I asked about seeing him myself, she said he was booked solid for months, and she'd been lucky to get even a phone consultation for my prescription. By the 3rd week, entire chunks of my day were disappearing. I'd wake up at 3 in the afternoon, Mom telling me I'd been up all morning helping her organize the garage, but my muscles didn't ache and my clothes were clean. My phone showed text conversations with Jason that made no sense, apologies I never typed, promises to work things out that contradicted the rage I still felt in my chest. When I confronted Mom about the messages, she pulled me into a hug that smelled like her rosemary shampoo and whispered that I'd been having episodes, crying and calling him, begging him to take me back. She said it broke her heart to watch, but the medication would help stabilize my mood soon. That night she increased my dose, adding a small yellow pill that she said would help with the memory gaps. I trusted her completely then, even when my old friend Heather called asking why I'd stood her up for lunch 3 times that month, dates I had no recollection of making. The turning point came on a Thursday morning when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize myself. My face looked puffy, my eyes unfocused like I was looking through someone else's pupils, and there were scratches on my arms I couldn't explain. Mom was in the kitchen making her special pancakes with cinnamon, humming that old Carole King song she loved, acting like everything was perfectly normal. When I showed her the scratches, she sighed and led me to the living room, where she'd apparently installed a baby monitor without telling me. She played back footage from the night before. There I was, clear as day, scratching at my arms in my sleep, mumbling incoherently about needing to leave. But something about the video felt wrong. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., but the light coming through my bedroom window looked more like dusk than middle of the night. When I pointed this out, Mom's expression shifted for just a second, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, before she suggested we call Dr. Morse to adjust my medication again. I started hiding the pills under my tongue that night, spitting them out when Mom left the room. The clarity that returned over the next 48 hours hit me like stepping out of a swimming pool after being underwater too long. My thoughts sharpened, the fog lifted, and suddenly I could see the inconsistencies everywhere. The prescription bottle in the medicine cabinet had no pharmacy label, just a typed sticker Mom could have printed herself. The baby monitor wasn't just in my room. I found tiny cameras in the bathroom vent behind the kitchen clock, even in the basement where I'd been storing my boxes from the apartment. But the worst discovery came when I decided to search for Dr. Nathaniel Morse online. There were 3 in the state, but none within 200 miles of us. When I called their offices, pretending to be confirming an appointment, none had ever heard of me or my mother. My mouth went dry as I realized Mom had been making up this doctor, probably crushing up God knows what kind of pills and feeding them to me twice a day for nearly a month. That afternoon, while Mom was at her book club, I searched her room for the first time since moving back. Her closet was meticulously organized, shoes arranged by color, sweaters folded with military precision. Behind a stack of photo albums, I found a metal lockbox that my old house key surprisingly opened. Inside were 3 folders, each with a woman's name written in Mom's careful cursive: Amanda, Claire, and now mine. Amanda's folder contained newspaper clippings from 2014 about a young woman who'd disappeared from our neighborhood, last seen at a grocery store 2 blocks from our house. Claire's had medical records from 2017, discharge papers from a psychiatric facility in the next county, with Mom listed as her guardian despite Claire apparently being 28 years old at the time. My folder was the thinnest but the most terrifying. It had photos of me sleeping, dated from weeks before Jason and I had even broken up, and a handwritten note that said, "Finally coming home where she belongs." My legs nearly gave out when I realized she'd been planning this, waiting for an opportunity to get me back under her roof. I heard Mom's car pulling into the driveway earlier than expected, that familiar rumble of her old Buick that used to comfort me as a kid. Panicking, I shoved everything back into the lockbox, but my finger caught on a photo tucked behind Claire's folder. It was Mom with a young woman I didn't recognize, both smiling at what looked like a birthday dinner. The woman had bandages on her wrists and a glazed look in her eyes that I recognized from my own recent mirror reflections. On the back, Mom had written, "Jessica, 2008. Treatment successful, new placement arranged." The front door opened downstairs and I barely managed to get the box back in place before Mom called up, her voice sweet as honey, asking if I wanted some fresh lemonade. I came down trying to act normal, but she must have seen something in my face because she immediately asked if I'd taken my afternoon medication. When I lied and said yes, she smiled that too wide smile I was starting to recognize and said we should celebrate my progress with dinner at that Italian place downtown. But first, she insisted, I should take an extra pill since I seemed anxious. She watched me like a hawk as I pretended to swallow it. At the restaurant, Mom ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, just like she used to when I was 12. She kept reaching across the table to touch my hand, checking my pulse, she said, making sure the medication wasn't affecting my heart rate. The waiter, a kid maybe 19 years old with bright red hair and a crooked name tag that said Kevin, kept giving us strange looks, especially when Mom loudly explained that I was recovering from a nervous breakdown and shouldn't be trusted to make my own decisions yet. She even showed him the pill bottle, shaking it like a maraca while explaining my supposed condition to this complete stranger. I excused myself to the bathroom and seriously considered climbing out the window, but it was painted shut and probably hadn't been opened since the place was built. Instead, I splashed cold water on my face and made a decision. I needed to get into Mom's phone that night and find out exactly what she'd done to Amanda, Claire, and Jessica. When I returned to the table, Mom had already paid and was standing with my coat, telling me I looked tired and we should go home immediately so I could take my evening pills and rest. That night, I waited until I heard Mom's CPAP machine whirring from her bedroom before creeping down the hallway. Her phone was charging on the nightstand, the screen's blue glow casting weird shadows on her face as she slept. Her password was still my birthday. She'd never been good with technology. Her text messages revealed conversations with someone named Dr. Harold Finch, except he wasn't a doctor at all, but a veterinarian who'd lost his license in 2016 for selling animal tranquilizers. Their messages discussed dosages, effects, and how to keep someone compliant without causing permanent damage. One message from Mom made my stomach turn. This one's special, my actual daughter. Need to be more careful than with the others. Doctor. Finch had replied with specific instructions on rotating between 3 different drugs to prevent tolerance buildup. I scrolled further back and found discussions about Claire. Apparently, she'd been a neighbor's daughter who'd trusted Mom after her parents died in a car accident. Mom had convinced her she was having a mental breakdown, kept her drugged for 8 months before Claire's aunt from California started asking questions, and Mom had to let her go into legitimate psychiatric care to avoid suspicion. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice Mom's breathing pattern change until her hand grabbed my wrist. She'd been awake the whole time, watching me through half-closed eyes, letting me discover everything while she calculated her next move. Her grip was stronger than I expected, her fingernails digging crescents into my skin as she sat up slowly, that CPAP mask still strapped to her face, making her look like something out of a medical horror show. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with those hazel eyes that suddenly looked black in the darkness. Then she pressed something against my neck, a syringe I hadn't seen her holding. She whispered that she was disappointed I'd stopped taking my medication, that she'd only wanted to help me heal from Jason's betrayal, to keep me safe from a world that had hurt me so badly. The needle pricked my skin but didn't go deeper yet. She said I could choose: take the injection and wake up tomorrow with no memory of this, continue being her good daughter who needed care, or fight her and end up like Amanda. When I asked what happened to Amanda, Mom's face went completely blank, and she said Amanda had chosen wrong, that the basement floor had been redone that summer for a reason. In that moment, something primal kicked in, maybe the only clear thought I'd had in weeks. I told Mom I needed to use the bathroom first, that if I was going to forget everything, I at least wanted to pee with a clear mind one last time. It was such a mundane request that she actually loosened her grip, maybe remembering all those times she'd potty-trained me as a toddler. She followed me to the bathroom, syringe still in hand, but stayed outside the door like she always had when I was young, respecting that last bit of privacy. I locked the door and immediately opened the window I'd checked earlier that week. Unlike the restaurant, this one actually worked. I climbed out in my pajamas, barefoot on the cold roof tiles, and jumped into the garden below, landing hard on Mom's prized rose bushes. I heard her screaming my name as I ran to my car, thanking whatever deity might exist that I'd hidden a spare key under the bumper after locking myself out last month. I drove straight to the police station, my foot bleeding from the thorns, wearing nothing but flannel pajamas with cartoon cats on them, probably looking exactly like the mental patient Mom had been telling everyone I was. The detective who interviewed me, a woman named Officer Diane Crawford with tired eyes and coffee stains on her uniform, didn't believe me at first. Not until I showed her the photos on my phone I'd managed to take of Mom's text messages and told her about the basement floor renovation in 2014, right after Amanda's disappearance. They got a warrant that morning and found enough evidence in Mom's house to arrest her. The veterinary drugs, the cameras, the folders on all of us, and Jamie Finch rolled on her immediately when they brought him in. They didn't find Amanda's body under the basement floor, but they found traces of blood that matched her DNA from a missing persons case. Mom had been doing this for over a decade, finding vulnerable women, convincing them they were sick, keeping them dependent on her twisted version of care. She's awaiting trial now, and her lawyer is actually trying to argue that she has a mental condition that makes her believe she's helping people. Claire testified last week. Turns out she remembers more than Mom thought, including Mom telling her that she was practice for when her real daughter finally came home. I'm living with my cousin in Oregon now, as far from that house as I can get. Sometimes I still wake up at exactly 8 in the morning and 9 at night, my body expecting those pills. But at least now when I wake up, I know exactly where I am and how I got there. The spreadsheet on my monitor kept blurring that April afternoon, numbers swimming together after 8 hours of quarterly reports. 6 months into living alone, and the thing that kept me going through these long days at the accounting firm was knowing nobody would be waiting at my apartment door, asking why I was 10 minutes late. My studio sat on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and pipes that groaned whenever someone flushed a toilet 3 floors down. Every morning at 5 a.m., the ancient radiator would bang out a rhythm like Morse code, but I'd grown to love it. My mother had called it a death trap when she helped me move in, spent 2 hours pointing out every possible hazard: the steep stairs, the lack of a second exit, the neighborhood full of what she called suspicious characters. Dad had to physically guide her to their car while she listed all the ways I could die living alone at 24. A Thursday in my 2nd week changed everything. The key stuck in my lock the way it always did, requiring that special wiggle-lift-turn combination I'd perfected. But when the door swung open, my laundry sat on the bed in perfect stacks. Not the heap I'd abandoned on my desk chair that morning while rushing to catch the bus. These were folded with surgical precision, arranged in a gradient from light to dark, socks rolled into those tiny spherical bundles that only one person in my life had ever managed to create. My mother's signature move, down to the way she tucked the toe under to keep them from unraveling. Mr. Garrett, the building's ancient superintendent who needed 10 minutes to climb 1 flight of stairs, couldn't have done this. The windows remained latched from inside. The door showed 0 scratches around the lock, and nothing else had been disturbed. I convinced myself the landlord must have let someone in for maintenance, and they'd been really weird about touching my stuff. Maybe a new cleaning service trying to drum up business? I even called the property management company, and the woman who answered laughed when I asked if they offered complimentary laundry folding. She said Mr. Garrett could barely remember which key went to which apartment, much less organize a secret maid service. For 3 days, nothing else happened, and I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd had some kind of stress-induced memory lapse. Then Monday rolled around, and I walked into my apartment to find a pot of beef stew simmering on my single-burner stove. The smell hit me first. Bay leaves, rosemary, that specific ratio of onions to carrots that created a sweetness without adding sugar. The exact recipe my mother had made every Monday since I could remember, down to the little oil spots floating on top in a pattern I'd stared at through hundreds of family dinners. My laptop bag hit the floor while I stood there, watching steam curl up from the pot like it belonged there. The stove's knob pointed to low heat, keeping everything at the perfect temperature for someone arriving home at 6:47 p.m., my usual time. I checked everywhere, under the bed, in the bathroom, behind the shower curtain, even inside the narrow coat closet that could barely fit my winter jacket. Nobody. The deadbolt was still engaged when I'd arrived, the chain lock dangling exactly where I'd left it that morning. But someone had been here. Someone who knew my schedule, my mother's recipes, the precise temperature that kept stew from burning but maintained that gentle bubble around the edges. I didn't eat it. Dumped the whole thing down the toilet and flushed 3 times. Then threw the pot in the dumpster outside because keeping it in my kitchen felt like leaving evidence of something I couldn't explain. The next morning I called in sick and drove to the hardware store on Riverside Avenue. Bought a new deadbolt, one of those expensive ones with the anti-pick pins and reinforced strike plate that the guy behind the counter said would stop anyone short of using a battering ram. Spent 4 hours installing it myself, watching YouTube videos on my phone, stripping screws and starting over twice because my hands kept trembling whenever I heard footsteps in the hallway. Changed the regular lock too, even added a chain that could supposedly withstand 400 pounds of force. The locksmith at the store cut me 3 new keys, one for my keyring, one hidden in my desk at work, and one I sealed in an envelope and gave to my friend Brandon with instructions to only use it if I died or disappeared. He laughed, said I was being paranoid, but took it anyway after seeing the look on my face. For 5 days, my apartment stayed exactly as I left it. No folded clothes, no mysterious meals, no rearranged items. I started documenting everything with my phone, taking pictures of how I positioned things before leaving, comparing them when I returned. The relief felt incredible, like finally being able to exhale after holding your breath underwater. Maybe changing the locks had solved whatever was happening. Then Friday arrived, and the moment I opened my door, the familiar scent of lavender fabric softener drifted out. My bed was made with military corners, the sheets pulled so tight you could bounce a quarter off them. The pillowcases had been replaced with fresh ones, the light blue set with tiny white flowers that I'd stuffed in a garbage bag the day I moved out because they reminded me of home. They were arranged perfectly, including that weird thing my mother did where she folded the top sheet back exactly 8 inches and tucked it under the mattress in a way that created a perfect envelope for the comforter. That weekend, I barely slept. Spent most of Saturday night sitting in my desk chair with a baseball bat across my lap, jumping at every creak and groan the old building made. By Sunday afternoon, exhaustion had made me stupid brave, and I drove to Best Buy with a credit card I'd been keeping for emergencies. Bought 3 cameras, tiny ones designed for home security that could stream directly to my phone. The sales guy tried to upsell me on a whole system, but I just needed to see who was coming into my space. Set them up in corners where they'd catch the door, the kitchenette, and the bed area, hidden behind books and inside a fake plant I'd bought specifically for camouflage. Monday through Wednesday, I watched the feeds obsessively during work, minimizing spreadsheets every time my boss walked past. Nothing. Just my empty apartment with dust particles floating through afternoon sunlight. Thursday changed my entire understanding of what safety meant. At 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert, the screen lighting up my face in the darkness of my bedroom. I opened the app with fingers that wouldn't stay steady, and there she was, my mother, using a key to let herself in like she owned the place. She wore her purple fleece robe over pajamas, the same outfit she'd worn for my entire childhood when checking on me at night. The camera caught her perfectly as she moved through my apartment with practiced efficiency, straightening things that didn't need straightening, adjusting the thermostat from 68 to 72 because she'd always insisted anything below 70 would give me pneumonia. She spent 20 minutes in my kitchenette, and I watched her smell my milk, check expiration dates on everything in my mini fridge, then pull items from a grocery bag she'd brought. Fresh vegetables, fruit, containers of pre-made meals labeled with days of the week in her distinctive handwriting. The worst part was watching her go through my garbage. She pulled out the trash bag, examined every item like an archaeologist studying ancient artifacts. The frozen pizza box from dinner, the beer bottles from when Brandon visited, the tissue I'd thrown away after a nosebleed. She photographed the beer bottles with her phone, shaking her head in that disappointed way I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. Then she moved to my bathroom, and I watched her count my towels, smell my sheets, even check inside my medicine cabinet where she rearranged my ibuprofen and vitamins into what she must have considered the correct order. At one point, she sat on my bed and just cried, holding my pillow against her face like she was trying to breathe me in. She stayed there for 10 minutes, rocking slightly, whispering something the camera's audio couldn't quite catch. When she finally left at 3:47 a.m., she locked both locks and tested the door twice to make sure it was secure, protecting me from everyone but herself. I didn't go to work Friday. Instead, I sat in my car outside my parents' house in Oakwood Heights, watching my mother through the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast for my father. She moved with the same efficiency I'd seen on the camera, every gesture practiced and purposeful. When I finally knocked, she answered wearing an apron that said, "World's Best Mom" in faded letters, her face lighting up like Christmas morning. Before she could speak, I held up my phone showing her the video, her purple robe clearly visible on the screen. The change was instant. Her smile flattened into something I'd never seen before, her eyes going hard as granite. She didn't deny it, didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, she stepped aside and said I should come in. We needed to talk about why I was spying on her. Not why she was breaking into my apartment, why I was spying on her. My father was already at work, and suddenly being alone with her felt dangerous in a way it never had during my entire childhood. The kitchen felt smaller as she closed the door behind me, her hand lingering on the deadbolt before turning it with a decisive click. She poured coffee into my old mug, the one with the cartoon dinosaur I'd used since 3rd grade, and set it in front of me with deliberate calm. Then she sat across from me and explained, in the patient tone she'd used to teach me multiplication tables, that I wasn't ready to live alone. She had a notebook, pulled from the kitchen drawer, filled with observations from her visits, what I'd eaten, how many hours I'd slept based on my sheet patterns, the concerning websites in my browser history she'd checked, even the brand of toothpaste I'd switched to without consulting her. 3 months of surveillance documented in her neat cursive. When I stood to leave, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and told me I could move back home today. She'd already kept my room exactly as I'd left it. The pressure of her fingers increased when I tried to pull away, her manicured nails starting to dig crescents into my skin. Her voice stayed sweet, conversational, as she described how she could make things very difficult with my landlord, my job, my friends. She knew more about my life than I'd realized, had been making calls, checking up, ensuring everyone knew I had problems that required supervision. When I finally yanked my arm free and headed for the door, she followed with the kitchen knife she'd been using to cut fruit earlier. Not threatening exactly, just holding it while she talked about how hurt she felt, how ungrateful I was being, how no one would ever care for me the way she did. The blade caught the morning light as she gestured, her voice rising to something between a sob and a scream, saying I was killing her, that she'd die without being able to take care of me, that she'd rather see me dead than living badly on my own. I ran then, actually ran from my childhood home, while my mother stood in the doorway shouting that she'd always have a key, that changing locks meant nothing, that she'd made copies at every hardware store in the city. The last thing I heard before my car door slammed was her promising she'd see me soon, that she'd make dinner on Sunday like always, that I couldn't escape being her baby. I drove straight to the police station on Grant Boulevard, my wrist already bruising into purple-green stripes where she'd grabbed me. The officer who took my report, a tired-looking woman named Officer Daniels, listened to the whole story while typing slowly on an ancient keyboard. She asked if I wanted to press charges for breaking and entering, assault, criminal threats. I said yes to everything, showed her the videos from my apartment, the marks on my arm, even played her the voicemail my mother left while I was sitting in the station, 43 seconds of her explaining she'd already made my favorite casserole for dinner, and I needed to come home before it got cold. Officer Daniels helped me file for an emergency restraining order that afternoon. She said mothers like mine often escalated when they felt their control slipping, suggested I stay with a friend for a few days. Brandon let me crash on his couch, and we spent the weekend looking at apartments in different neighborhoods, places my mother wouldn't think to look. She called him 18 times on Saturday alone, left messages with his roommate about my medication schedules and dietary restrictions, even showed up at his building at midnight claiming I was suicidal and needed immediate help. Monday morning, the police served her with the restraining order at her house. My father called me an hour later, his voice hollow and confused, saying she'd collapsed when they handed her the papers, had to be sedated by paramedics. She's in treatment now, some facility upstate that specializes in attachment disorders, though the doctors won't call it that exactly. My father sends updates sometimes. She's doing better. She's started to understand boundaries. She's learning to let go. I don't respond. I moved to a new apartment 8 months ago in a building with a doorman and security cameras in every hallway, changed my phone number, even legally changed my middle name so she couldn't track me through public records. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. certain I smell her lavender fabric softener, and I have to check every lock twice before I can fall back asleep. My therapist says the hypervigilance will fade with time. That setting boundaries with someone who raised you is one of the hardest things a person can do. But at least now when I come home, my laundry stays unfolded, my food stays uneaten, and my life stays mine. My mother never talked about her time at Millbrook State Hospital. Not once in 22 years did she mention the psychiatric facility where she'd worked before I was born, and I only knew about it because of an old employment certificate I'd accidentally found buried in her filing cabinet She kept that part of her life locked away, as tightly as the medication cart she supervised at Columbus General, where she'd been an ER nurse for as long as I could remember. Maybe that should have been my first warning sign, the way she could discuss every other job she'd ever held, from her first position at a rural clinic to her brief stint in pediatrics. But Millbrook? That place didn't exist in her stories. Professor Whitman changed all that during my pharmacology lecture that Wednesday morning in March, when she pulled up a slide showing the abandoned building's photograph, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes staring back at our classroom. Millbrook State Hospital, she announced, tapping the projection screen with her laser pointer. Closed in 1999 following the disappearance of a patient named Robert Lawson and the subsequent investigation that revealed decades of unethical practices. The coffee I'd been nursing suddenly tasted bitter, and I found myself leaning forward in my seat, something pulling at the edges of my memory. Professor Whitman continued describing how the hospital had operated for 60 years, housing over 3,000 patients at its peak, many of them subjected to experimental treatments that were never properly documented. She said Robert Lawson had been admitted in 1998 for severe bipolar disorder, a 34-year-old carpenter from Canton who'd had a psychotic break after his wife left him, and that his disappearance on June 15, 1999, had triggered everything. Families demanding answers, employees refusing to talk, records mysteriously missing or destroyed. I was born 3 months after that date, September 1999, and the coincidence made my stomach churn in a way that had nothing to do with the cafeteria breakfast burrito I'd scarfed down between clinical rotations. After class, I couldn't focus on anything else. My study group was reviewing medication dosages for our upcoming exam, but all I could think about was that employment certificate I'd seen years ago, the dates on it now burning in my mind with new significance. My mother had worked at Millbrook from 1997 to 1999, leaving just weeks after Robert Lawson disappeared. During my lunch break, I sat in my beat-up Toyota Corolla in the parking garage and pulled up old newspaper archives on my phone, searching for anything about the case. The Columbus Dispatch had run several articles, and one included a grainy black-and-white photo of Robert Lawson that made me drop my phone onto the floorboard. He had these distinctive heterochromatic eyes, one brown, one partially green, and a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow that gave him a perpetually quizzical expression. The same eyes I saw every morning in my bathroom mirror, the same scar I'd always been told came from a childhood accident I couldn't remember. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in scientific thinking and evidence-based practice, tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Plenty of people have heterochromia, maybe one in every few hundred, and scars above eyebrows weren't exactly rare either. But then I noticed something else in the article that made my mouth go dry. Robert Lawson's middle name was Anthony, and my middle name, the one my mother said she'd chosen because it sounded strong, was Antonia. The article mentioned he'd been an accomplished carpenter who specialized in restoring Victorian houses, and I thought about the antique wooden jewelry box on my dresser, the one my mother said had been a gift from someone special before I was born. Its corners joined with dovetail joints so precise they looked machine-made but weren't. Each piece fitted together like a puzzle meant to last forever. I drove straight to my mother's house after my shift ended at 7 that evening, my mind racing faster than my old Corolla could handle the highway curves. She lived in the same 2-story colonial in Worthington where I'd grown up, its yellow paint fading but the garden still immaculate, rows of white roses she tended with an almost obsessive precision. When I walked through the front door using my spare key, I found her in the kitchen making dinner, her scrubs still on from her shift, humming that old Fleetwood Mac song she always hummed when she thought no one was listening. The normalcy of it all made me want to scream. I pulled out my phone and showed her the article about Robert Lawson, watching her face the way I'd learned to watch patients for signs of distress. Her expression didn't change, not at first, but I saw her grip on the wooden spoon tighten until her knuckles went white, and a tiny muscle near her jaw started twitching, the same tell she had when a trauma came in that hit too close to home. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice steady but hollow, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. I told her about Professor Whitman's lecture, about the dates lining up, about the eyes and the scar, and everything else that couldn't just be coincidence. She set down the spoon with deliberate care, turned off the stove, and walked to the window that overlooked the backyard where I'd played as a child, where she'd pushed me on that old tire swing until I got dizzy from laughing. For a long moment she just stood there, and I could see her reflection in the glass, her face finally cracking like porcelain under pressure. "I need you to understand something," she said, still facing away from me, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Robert Lawson was a very sick man. The things he did, the things he was capable of. I protected you from all of it. Every single day of your life, I protected you." Her shoulders started shaking, and when she finally turned around, I saw tears streaming down her face. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like relief. She led me to the basement, a place I'd always found excuses to avoid as a kid, claiming it was too cold or too dark or just gave me bad dreams. My mother pulled a box from behind the water heater, one of those old fireproof safes that looked like it belonged in a bank from the 1950s. Inside were documents I'd never seen, admission papers from Millbrook with Robert's name, medical records with diagnoses that made my nursing training kick in, schizoaffective disorder, severe paranoid delusions, violent ideation with homicidal features. But what made me sink onto the bottom step was a photograph tucked between the papers. My mother, young and smiling, standing next to Robert Lawson at what looked like a hospital Christmas party. Her hand rested on her stomach, which showed the unmistakable curve of early pregnancy. On the back, in her handwriting, December 1998, before he knew. She sat down beside me, her hand finding mine, and started talking in this monotone voice I'd never heard her use before, clinical and detached, like she was giving report on a patient she'd never met. "He wasn't always sick," she began, staring at the concrete wall across from us. "When I first started at Millbrook, Robert was a voluntary admission. He'd checked himself in after a manic episode, wanted to get stable before it got worse. He was brilliant, funny, could make these beautiful things with his hands. That jewelry box was the first gift he ever gave me. We weren't supposed to get involved with patients, but he was so different during his good periods, so completely himself." She explained how they'd hidden their relationship for months, how she'd believed she could help him stay stable, how she'd gotten pregnant during one of his good stretches when he seemed almost completely normal. But then his medication stopped working, or maybe he stopped taking it, she never knew for sure. The delusions started creeping back in January 1999. He became convinced that the baby wasn't his, that it was part of some government experiment, that the hospital was using patients to breed super soldiers or mind readers or whatever his brain conjured up that day. He'd started following other pregnant staff members, taking photos, creating these elaborate charts connecting dots that didn't exist. The night of June 15, 1999, my mother had been working a double shift in the secured wing when Robert somehow got hold of a keycard. They never figured out how. Security footage showed him walking calmly through the halls at 2:47 a.m., dressed in street clothes he'd hidden somewhere, carrying a canvas bag nobody had seen before. He went straight to the employee break room where my mother was resting between rounds, 7 months pregnant and exhausted. She woke up to find him standing over her with a syringe filled with something clear, whispering that he needed to extract the surveillance device from her stomach before they activated it. The only reason she survived was because another nurse, Dorothy Huang, had forgotten her car keys and came back at exactly the right moment. Dorothy screamed, Robert ran, and security locked down the building within minutes. But he was already gone. Not escaped, they realized later, but hiding somewhere in the massive facility, in one of the hundreds of rooms that hadn't been used in years, places where the lights had been disconnected to save money, and the doors rusted shut from decades of moisture. They searched for 3 days, police, staff, even some of the more stable patients who knew the hidden spots. My mother said the worst part was knowing he was still there, somewhere in those 400,000 square feet of corridors and abandoned wards, watching and waiting. She could hear footsteps in the walls at night. Or maybe she imagined them. Everyone did during those 3 days. On the third night, the head of security, a former Marine named Frank Dalton, decided to check the old hydrotherapy room in the basement's east wing, a place that had been sealed since the 70s. The door had been pried open from the inside, its lock destroyed with some kind of tool. Inside, they found Robert's bag with detailed blueprints of the hospital's ventilation system, employee schedules with certain names circled in red ink, and a journal filled with pages and pages about the pregnancy experiments and how he was going to save the babies by performing emergency C-sections. My mother's name appeared on every single page, sometimes written hundreds of times in increasingly erratic handwriting. But Robert himself was at the bottom of the old therapy pool, which had been drained decades ago, leaving just a 12-foot concrete pit with a rusty drain at the center. My mother's voice cracked when she described what they found. Robert had fallen, or jumped, nobody could tell, and the impact had been instant. But what disturbed everyone wasn't just his death. It was what he'd done in those 3 days hiding in that room. The walls were covered with mathematical equations written in what turned out to be his own blood, complex formulas that the state investigators later identified as legitimate biochemical calculations about fetal development, mixed with complete nonsense about radio frequencies and mind control. He'd removed several of his own teeth and arranged them in a pattern on the floor that he'd labeled transmission array in careful block letters. The investigators found evidence that he'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months, stealing supplies and hiding them throughout the hospital. But the thing that made my mother leave Millbrook forever, the detail that she'd never told anyone until now, was the stack of Polaroid photos they found in his pocket, all of them showing her sleeping in the break room on different nights, taken from a ceiling vent he'd apparently been accessing for months, watching her, documenting her pregnancy's progression with clinical notes written on each photo's white border. She pulled out one last document from the safe, a birth certificate with my name but no father listed, dated September 18th, 1999. "I had you 2 weeks early," she said, her hand squeezing mine so tight it hurt. "The stress from everything," the doctors said. "But I think somehow you knew it was time to get out, to be born into a world where he couldn't reach you." She explained how she'd legally changed our last names, moved twice in 6 months, created an entirely new history for us both. The other nurses who knew, Dorothy especially, they'd helped cover the trail, understanding that some secrets were worth keeping. The hospital's closure helped. With all the chaos of the investigation, one missing patient file among thousands hardly mattered. "I know I should have told you," she whispered, finally meeting my eyes. "But how do you tell your daughter that her father was a brilliant monster? That the same genes that gave you those beautiful eyes also carried something broken and dangerous? Every time you got upset as a child, every teenage mood swing, I watched and wondered and prayed that you'd inherited only the good parts of him." We sat in that basement until almost midnight, surrounded by the evidence of a past she'd tried so hard to bury, and I understood that every single choice she'd made, every move, every lie, every moment of overprotection I'd resented growing up, had been her way of making sure Robert Lawson stayed dead. Last summer, I drove 8 hours straight to help my mother pack up the house where I grew up. She was 73, her knees were shot, and after Dad passed 2 years earlier, that big colonial in Pennsylvania had become too much for her to handle alone. I took a week off from my job as an electrician in Chicago, figuring we'd sort through 40 years of accumulated memories, donate what we could, and get her settled into a nice apartment closer to my sister in Pittsburgh. What should have been a straightforward, if emotional task, turned into something that fundamentally changed how I see my entire childhood, my mother, and the seemingly ordinary house where I spent the first 18 years of my life. Mom seemed nervous when I arrived that Saturday morning, her usual warm smile strained at the edges. She kept steering me away from the basement, insisting we start with the attic instead, then the bedrooms, then the garage, anywhere but downstairs where Dad's old workshop and the holiday decorations were stored. At first, I figured she was just being sentimental about Dad's tools, maybe not ready to let go of that part of him yet. But when I finally insisted we tackle the basement on day 3, she went pale and said she needed to run to the pharmacy, leaving me alone in the house for the first time since I'd arrived. That's when I noticed something strange about the basement layout. The dimensions didn't match what I remembered, and there was a section of wall behind the furnace that looked newer than everything else, painted a slightly different shade of gray. The wall behind the furnace had always been solid concrete when I was a kid. I knew because I'd helped Dad install shelving units there when I was 14. But now, tapping on it with my knuckles, it sounded hollow, like drywall over a frame. I grabbed a flashlight and examined it closer, finding seams that had been carefully mudded and sanded but were still visible if you knew what to look for. Someone had built this wall maybe 15-20 years ago, judging by the wear on the paint. My parents had never mentioned any renovation down here. I texted my sister asking if she remembered any basement work being done, but she was as clueless as I was. The more I studied that wall, the more it bothered me. Why would someone wall off part of an already small basement? I spent an hour moving boxes away from that section, telling myself I was just being thorough with the cleaning. Behind an old dresser pushed against the suspicious wall, I found what I was looking for and dreading at the same time. The outline of a door, painted over, but unmistakably there. My chest tightened as I ran my fingers along the barely visible seams. This door had been sealed shut, not just locked but actually sealed, with what looked like dozens of layers of paint and possibly caulk underneath. Whatever was behind there, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed forgotten. I sat on the basement steps for a while, debating whether to leave it alone, but curiosity won out. Using a utility knife from Dad's workbench, I began carefully cutting through the paint seal, each slice revealing more evidence that this door hadn't been opened in a very long time. The door finally gave way after 20 minutes of prying with a crowbar, the seal breaking with a sound like ripping fabric. A stale, preserved smell hit me immediately. Not rot or mold, but something else, like a museum storage room that hadn't been aired out in decades. I shined my flashlight into the darkness and saw a narrow set of wooden stairs leading down to what appeared to be another room, maybe 8 feet below the main basement level. My house had a sub-basement I never knew existed. The stairs looked sturdy enough, though covered in a thick layer of dust that showed no footprints, no disturbance at all. I called out, "Hello?" feeling ridiculous, but the silence that answered back was somehow worse than if I'd heard something. Every instinct told me to close that door and pretend I'd never found it, but I'd already come this far. The room at the bottom of those stairs made me stop breathing for a moment. It was a child's bedroom, perfectly preserved like someone had just sealed it up yesterday. A twin bed with dinosaur sheets neatly made. A small desk with coloring books still open, crayons scattered as if a kid had just stepped away. Toys from the late 70s or early 80s lined wooden shelves, original Star Wars figures, Hot Wheels cars, a teddy bear with one eye missing sitting in a child-sized rocking chair. But what made my legs weak was the wall of photographs above the bed. Dozens of pictures of a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile. In every photo where my mother appeared, she looked exactly like she did in my own childhood pictures, except younger. This boy had lived in our house. This boy had been my mother's son. I found his name on a certificate hanging on the wall, Matthew. First place in a spelling bee, dated May 1981, 3 years before I was born. My legs gave out and I sat hard on the dusty floor, trying to process what I was seeing. Matthew would have been my brother. An older brother I'd never known existed, whose entire existence had been erased from our family history so thoroughly that in 38 years of life, I'd never seen a single photo, never heard a single story, Never even heard his name whispered in passing. The room had more evidence of his life. Report cards showing excellent grades, handmade Mother's Day cards with "I love you, Mommy" written in crayon, a height chart marked on the door frame that stopped at 4 feet 2 inches. The last mark was dated November 1981. I went through everything in that room with shaking hands, looking for any clue about what happened to Matthew. In the desk drawer, I found a journal, seemingly my mother's, with entries that made my throat close up. She wrote about Matthew's laugh, how he loved pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, how he was afraid of thunderstorms and would crawl into bed with her and Dad. Normal mom stuff. The entries were full of love and joy until late October 1981, when the tone shifted dramatically. She wrote about Matthew becoming difficult, about him saying things that weren't possible, about finding him in strange places at strange hours. The final entry, dated November 15, 1981, was just one line. "Dr. Brennan says it's for the best. God forgive me." After that, nothing. The journal ended, and apparently, so did Matthew's presence in our house. I heard the front door slam upstairs and my mother calling my name, her voice high and panicked. I grabbed the journal and climbed back up, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure how to ask. When she saw me emerging from behind the furnace, covered in dust and holding that journal, her face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before. She didn't try to explain or make excuses. She just sank onto the bottom step and began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and wounded. I sat beside her, waiting, the journal heavy in my lap. Finally, after what felt like hours, she began to speak in a voice so quiet, I had to lean in to hear her. "Matthew was special," she said. "Too special. He remembered things that hadn't happened yet. He knew things he couldn't possibly know." According to my mother, Matthew had started having what she initially thought were nightmares when he was 6. He'd wake up screaming about fires that would happen days later, describing them in perfect detail. The color of the houses, the names of the families, even what the firefighters would say. He knew when people would die before they got sick. He drew pictures of car accidents that would happen the following week, complete with license plate numbers. At first, my parents thought it was coincidence, but after Matthew warned them not to let Grandma visit for Thanksgiving because she would fall on the ice and not get up, and then Grandma did exactly that despite their warnings, they couldn't deny something was terribly wrong, or terribly right depending on how you looked at it. The local priest thought Matthew was possessed. The psychiatrist said it was childhood schizophrenia, but Dr. Brennan, a specialist they'd found through desperate research, had a different theory and a different solution. Dr. Brennan ran a private facility in upstate New York that specialized in children with what he called temporal cognitive displacement, kids whose minds somehow process time differently than the rest of us. He convinced my parents that Matthew needed specialized care, that staying in a normal environment would only make his condition worse, that the constant stress of seeing terrible things before they happened would eventually break his young mind completely. My mother showed me the admission papers she'd kept hidden in a safety deposit box all these years. Matthew had been committed to the Brennan Institute on November 16, 1981. The place had closed in 1995 after Dr. Brennan died, and all the patients had been transferred to various state facilities. She'd tried to find Matthew then, had hired a private investigator, but the trail went cold. The records were sealed or lost, and Matthew, if that was still his name, had vanished into the system. He would be 47 now, assuming he was still alive. The worst part wasn't learning about Matthew's existence or even his abandonment. It was discovering that my entire childhood had been shaped by his absence. My mother's overprotectiveness, her panic whenever I had nightmares, her strange relief when I turned 7 without showing any signs, it all made sense now. She'd been terrified of losing another son to whatever had taken Matthew. Whether you called it a gift, a curse, or a mental illness. I stayed with her for 3 more days and we talked about Matthew more than we'd ever talked about anything. She showed me the one video she had of him, a Super 8 film of his 7th birthday party, where he looked happy and normal until the end, when he whispered something to my father that made Dad drop the camera. We never found out what he said. Mom moved to that apartment in Pittsburgh as planned, but I kept the house. I've been renovating the basement, turned Matthew's room into a proper living space with windows and fresh air. Sometimes I wonder if he's out there somewhere, still seeing things before they happen, or if the system finally succeeded in making him forget his terrible gift. Either way, I leave the light on in what used to be his room, just in case he ever finds his way home. The night my mother met Ryan, she waited until he went to the bathroom at this Italian restaurant downtown before grabbing my wrist hard enough to leave marks and telling me he was dangerous. We'd only been dating for 2 months at that point, and everything had been perfect. He worked at the climbing gym where I'd been going after rough days at my graphic design job in Denver, and we just clicked instantly. Ryan had this infectious laugh that made everyone around him smile, collected vintage cameras that he'd actually use instead of just displaying them, and cooked the most incredible Thai food from recipes his grandmother had taught him during a summer he spent in Bangkok. My friends loved him. My co-workers thought he was charming when he dropped by the office with surprise lunch, and even my usually standoffish cat would curl up in his lap within minutes of him walking through the door. But my mother sat across from us that night, grilling him about his family, his finances, his 5-year plan, even asking point blank if he had any criminal history while we were still eating appetizers. Ryan handled it like a champion, answering everything with patience and humor, but I could see the vein in her temple throbbing the way it did when she was fighting to maintain control. After he excused himself, she leaned across the table with that grip on my wrist and whispered that he was manipulative, that she could see it in his eyes, the way he smiled too much, how he touched my shoulder when he talked. When I laughed it off, thinking she was just being her usual overprotective self, she squeezed harder and said I'd regret not listening to her, that mothers always know, that she'd do whatever it took to protect me from making the biggest mistake of my life. The waiter came by to refill our water glasses and she let go, switching back to her public face so fast it made my head spin, but her eyes stayed locked on mine with this intensity that made my appetite disappear completely. Things escalated after Ryan and I decided to move in together 6 months later. We found this cute apartment in Capitol Hill with exposed brick walls and a tiny balcony where we could grow herbs, and I honestly thought my mother would eventually come around once she saw how happy he made me. Instead, she called me crying at least 3 times a week, always with some new emergency that required my immediate attention. Her car wouldn't start. She thought someone was following her at the grocery store. She found a lump that turned out to be nothing. Her computer had a virus that mysteriously fixed itself by the time I arrived. Each visit ended with her begging me to leave Ryan, showing me articles she'd printed about domestic violence, about men who seemed perfect until they weren't, about daughters who wished they'd listened to their mothers. She'd grab my face between her hands and search my arms for bruises that didn't exist, asking if I needed help getting out, if he was threatening me, if I was too scared to tell the truth. The weird incident started small enough that Ryan and I initially wrote them off as bad luck. First, his car had 2 flat tires in the same week, both from nails that somehow punctured the sidewalls in spots that couldn't be patched. Then we started getting anonymous calls at all hours, sometimes breathing, sometimes just silence, sometimes a woman's voice whispering that we weren't safe before hanging up. Our landlord called saying someone had reported seeing us deal drugs from our balcony, which was insane, because the most rebellious thing we did was occasionally smoke a joint while watching Netflix. The police showed up twice for welfare checks, saying a concerned family member had reported that I was being held against my will, and both times I had to stand there in my pajamas explaining that I was fine while our neighbors watched from their doorways. Ryan started keeping a log of everything in this leather notebook, writing down dates and times and details, and when he showed it to me after a month, the pattern was undeniable. Everything happened within 24 hours of me declining one of my mother's invitations or not answering her calls quickly enough. Ryan wanted to confront her directly, but I kept making excuses because some part of me still couldn't believe my own mother would go that far. Then came the Saturday morning when we woke up to find every single plant on our balcony dead. The basil, the tomatoes, the lavender we'd been nurturing for months, all brown and withered like someone had poured bleach on the soil during the night. Ryan's vintage Leica, the one his grandfather had given him, went missing from his locked car along with nothing else, not even the cash in the center console. Our neighbor, Mrs. Nguyen, pulled me aside one afternoon and mentioned that a woman who looked exactly like me, only older, had been asking questions about our schedule, claiming to be doing a surprise visit but wanting to make sure we'd be home. The breaking point came when Ryan's boss at the climbing gym got an anonymous email with screenshots of fake social media posts about Ryan selling steroids, posts from an account that used his photos but had only been created a week earlier. I finally agreed to meet my mother at a coffee shop near her house to tell her she needed to stop, that I knew what she was doing. She showed up wearing this navy dress I'd given her for her birthday, looking perfectly put together like always, and ordered her usual vanilla latte with an extra shot. For 20 minutes she acted completely normal, asking about my work, talking about her book club, even complimenting a bracelet Ryan had given me, running her fingers over it like she was admiring the craftsmanship. Then, when I finally worked up the courage to bring up the incident, her whole demeanor shifted, not dramatically but in this subtle way that made every muscle in my body tense up. She stirred her coffee slowly, never breaking eye contact, and said that if strange things were happening, maybe I should consider it a sign that Ryan wasn't who I thought he was. When I told her I knew she was behind everything, she smiled this serene smile and said that a good mother protects her child, even when that child is too blind to see the danger right in front of her. I left that coffee shop determined to cut her out of my life completely, blocked her number right there in the parking lot, and told Ryan we needed to consider getting a restraining order. For about a week, everything went quiet. No mysterious calls, no flat tires, no police visits, and I started to feel like maybe she'd finally gotten the message. Ryan and I even celebrated with dinner at this Argentine steakhouse he'd been wanting to try, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe without waiting for the next disaster to hit. We were walking back to his car afterward, holding hands and talking about taking a vacation to Vancouver, when my mother appeared out of nowhere from behind a parked van. She was wearing all black, her hair pulled back tight, and she had this look in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something wilder, more desperate. Before either of us could react, she lunged at Ryan with something silver in her hand. Turned out to be a letter opener she'd been carrying in her purse, and started screaming that he was poison, that he'd stolen her daughter, that she'd kill him before she let him destroy my life. Ryan managed to grab her wrist before she could actually stab him, but she fought like something possessed, clawing at his face with her free hand, leaving these deep scratches down his cheek that immediately started bleeding. People on the street started gathering. Someone called 911, and I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before I finally snapped out of it and tried to pull her off him. She spun toward me then, and the look of betrayal on her face when she realized I was defending him instead of her was something I'll never forget. Like I'd reached into her chest and ripped her heart out with my bare hands. The police arrived just as she collapsed onto the sidewalk, sobbing and wailing that I'd regret this day for the rest of my life, that when Ryan showed his true colors and hurt me, I'd come crawling back begging for forgiveness. They arrested her right there on assault charges, and Ryan had to go to the emergency room to get his face cleaned up and make sure the scratches wouldn't get infected. One of them was dangerously close to his eye. While we sat in that sterile waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and floor wax, he held my hand and told me it wasn't my fault. That mental illness makes people do terrible things, but I couldn't stop replaying every warning sign I'd ignored over the years. The way she'd sabotaged my high school friendships by spreading rumors about the girls I hung out with, how she'd called my college dorm room at midnight crying whenever I went to parties, The time she faked a heart scare the night before my job interview in Seattle so I'd stay in Denver. The prosecutor said we had a solid case for a restraining order, and with multiple witnesses to the attack plus Ryan's injuries documented, my mother would likely face actual jail time. She got out on bail the next morning, and that's when things got genuinely terrifying. Ryan and I came home from the police station to find our apartment door slightly open, though nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. It wasn't until we went to feed his fish that we realized she'd been there. All 6 of his tropical fish were floating dead in the tank, the water cloudy with what looked like dish soap. There was a single photo placed on our bed, one from my 5th birthday party where she's holding me on her lap, both of us smiling at the camera, except she'd carefully cut Ryan out of every other photo in our album and arranged the pieces around it like some twisted collage. The security footage from our building showed her entering with a key I didn't even know she had, wearing the same clothes from the night before, moving through our space with this eerie calmness for almost an hour. We changed the locks immediately, installed extra deadbolts, even got a doorbell camera, but the damage was already done. Neither of us could sleep properly anymore, jumping at every noise in the hallway, double-checking the windows obsessively. The violation of bail conditions meant she went back to jail, this time without the option of posting bond again, and the judge expedited our restraining order to include a 500-foot minimum distance and 0 contact through third parties. My aunt called me crying, saying my mother had been calling her from jail, begging her to convince me to drop the charges, claiming Ryan had brainwashed me, that she'd seen bruises he'd supposedly given me that never existed. Other relatives started taking sides, some saying I was being too harsh on a woman who just loved me too much, others admitting they'd noticed concerning behavior for years but never wanted to interfere. Ryan's parents offered to let us stay at their cabin in Montana for a while, just to get away from everything, and we seriously considered it until his mom forwarded us an email she'd received from an anonymous account with photos of their house, their car, even their dog in the backyard, along with a message saying that anyone who helped us would regret it. We ended up moving to a different state entirely. I won't say where because honestly, part of me still worries she'll find this post somehow and track us down. Ryan proposed to me 6 months after we settled into our new life, and we got married at the courthouse with just 2 witnesses. No family invited because we couldn't risk word getting back to her. She's still in prison for at least another year according to the last update I got from the prosecutor, but I know that countdown is ticking in her head just like it is in mine. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear her voice, or I'll see a woman with her hair color at the grocery store and have to leave my cart right there in the aisle. Ryan never complains, never makes me feel crazy for being paranoid, just holds me and reminds me that we're safe now, that the restraining order is permanent, that we've done everything right. But I know my mother better than anyone, and when she used to say she'd do whatever it took to protect me, she meant it. The only thing that's changed is now she believes she needs to protect me from the life I've chosen, and that kind of twisted love doesn't just disappear when the prison sentence ends. I'd been living in Springfield, Illinois for about 2 months when everything started getting weird with my neighbor. I work from home as a software developer, spend most days in my home office with Duke, my German Shepherd, sleeping by my feet. The neighborhood was one of those quiet suburban streets where nothing much happens. 60s ranch houses, chain-link fences, big yards with old oak trees. I'd picked this place specifically because of the backyard, plenty of room for Duke to run around, and the price was right for a single guy with a steady remote job. Most of the neighbors were older couples or young families, everyone friendly enough but not intrusive. The kind of place where you'd wave if you saw someone getting their mail, but never felt obligated to make small talk. Duke loved it here, especially after living in apartments for so long, and I figured we'd found ourselves a good spot to settle down for a while. The woman next door stood out immediately, but not for good reasons. Her name was Lorraine, somewhere in her mid-40s with this artificial red hair that looked like she'd been dyeing it the same shade since high school. She lived there with her son Tommy, this skinny kid about 14 who always wore the same faded NASCAR jacket no matter how hot it got. Every single time I went into my backyard, and I mean every time, I'd see her at her kitchen window. Not moving around doing normal kitchen stuff, just standing there perfectly still with her palms pressed flat against the counter, watching me through these yellowed lace curtains. At first I thought maybe she was just protective of her property, or worried about Duke getting too close to the fence. But even when I was just sitting on my deck reading emails or grilling dinner, there she'd be, that pale face behind the glass, never blinking, never looking away, just observing everything I did like she was taking mental notes. Things got stranger when I started noticing patterns in her behavior. She'd appear at that window within 30 seconds of me stepping outside, like she had some kind of sensor that alerted her. One afternoon, I tested it by going in and out of my back door 5 times over an hour, pretending to forget something each time. Sure enough, there she was, every single time, same position, same dead stare. The really unsettling part was how she'd react when other people came over. I had a buddy, Carl, stop by to help me install a new ceiling fan, and the entire time he was there, Lorraine stood at different windows, following us from room to room. Carl noticed it too, kept asking if my neighbor was okay, said she gave him the creeps. But the worst part was when he went to his truck to grab a tool. She actually came outside, walked right up to him, and started asking these really specific questions about who he was, where he lived, if he had any kids, all while maintaining this fake concerned smile that never reached her eyes. Duke started acting weird about 3 weeks after I noticed Lorraine's watching habits. He'd always been friendly with everyone, the type of dog who'd roll over for belly rubs from strangers, but suddenly he refused to go near the fence line between our yards. He'd do his business, then immediately run back to the deck, tail tucked, whimpering at the back door to be let in. One morning I found him digging frantically at the corner where our properties met, right where this big elm tree created a natural blind spot from both houses. I called him back, but he kept returning to that spot, pawing at the ground and whining in this high-pitched way I'd never heard before. When I went to investigate, I noticed the earth there was softer than the rest of the yard, like it had been dug up and refilled recently. That's when Duke pulled something partially out of the ground, a corner of fabric, this faded blue material with little rocket ships on it. A child's blanket, wrapped around something that made my mouth go dry when I felt its weight and shape through the fabric. I didn't unwrap it right there. Instead, I carefully pulled the whole bundle free from the dirt, my brain already trying to rationalize what I was feeling through the fabric. Probably just some old tools, maybe lawn decorations, anything but what those rigid shapes actually felt like. The blanket was tied with yellow nylon rope, the kind you'd get at any hardware store, wrapped around several times and knotted tight. I brought it to my garage, closed the door, and laid it on my workbench under the fluorescent lights. Duke stayed outside, pacing and whining at the garage door. When I cut through the rope and peeled back the blanket, I found a baseball bat, the wooden kind, stained dark on one end. There was also a wallet, leather and weathered, with an ID still visible through the plastic window. Some guy named George Hoffman, who, according to the date, would have been 32 years old. The address on the license was from Decatur, about 40 minutes away. Underneath those was a cell phone, one of those older flip phones from maybe 10 years ago. The screen cracked, but the keypad still intact. The rational part of my brain wanted to call the police immediately, but something made me hesitate. I stood there in my garage, staring at these items that clearly belonged to someone who probably wasn't around anymore. And all I could think about was Lorraine at her window and her son Tommy, who never seemed to have any friends over. I decided to do some research first, just to understand what I was dealing with. I went inside, locked my doors, something I'd never done during the day before, and searched for George Hoffman from Decatur. What I found made me sick. He'd been reported missing 8 years ago, worked as a delivery driver for a furniture company, last seen making deliveries in this neighborhood. The article included a photo of him standing next to his delivery truck, smiling, wearing the same company polo shirt I could now see peeking out from the bottom of the blanket in my garage. His family had put up a $10,000 reward for information. They'd never found him. I spent the next 2 hours going down a rabbit hole of missing persons cases in the area. 3 others stood out, all from the last 12 years, all men who'd had some connection to this neighborhood. There was Paul Brenner, an HVAC technician who'd been doing repairs on this street 6 years ago. Joseph Mills, a substitute mail carrier who'd covered this route when the regular guy was sick, vanished 4 years back. And most recently, just 18 months ago, a college kid named Adrian Vega, who'd been going door to door selling alarm systems. All of them were last seen within a 3-block radius of where I was sitting. The thing that really got me was reading the comments on a local news site about Adrian. Multiple people mentioned that he'd been seen talking to a red-haired woman with a teenage boy the day he disappeared. The description of the woman's behavior, overly friendly at first, then asking invasive questions about his family, his schedule, where he lived, sounded exactly like what Lorraine had done with Carl. My first instinct was to pack up Duke and get the hell out of there, but I knew I couldn't just leave without doing something. Those families deserved answers. Plus, if I suddenly disappeared, who would know to look for me? I had to be smart about this. I wrapped everything back up in the blanket, put it in a plastic storage bin, and hid it behind some old paint cans in my garage. Then I did something that probably wasn't too bright. I decided to confront Lorraine. Not aggressively, just casually to feel her out. I walked over to her front door around dinner time, Duke reluctantly following on his leash. She answered before I even knocked, like she'd been watching me cross the yard. Up close, I could see her makeup was caked on thick, trying to cover what looked like deep scratch marks on her neck. Tommy was behind her in the hallway, just standing there in that NASCAR jacket staring at the floor. I told her Duke had dug up something weird in my yard, described the blanket without mentioning what was inside. Her face didn't change at all, but her knuckles went white where she gripped the doorframe. "Kids bury all sorts of things," she said, her voice flat and measured. "Tommy used to have such terrible nightmares about bad people coming to hurt us. I had to teach him that Mommy would never let that happen. I'd do anything to protect him. Anything." The way she said anything made every instinct scream at me to run. But then Tommy looked up for the first time since I'd moved in, and his eyes were red and swollen, like he'd been crying for hours. He mouthed something at me. I swear it looked like help, before Lorraine stepped sideways, blocking him from view. She kept talking, her voice taking on this sing-song quality that didn't match the intensity in her eyes. "You know, George used to live where you live now. Not George exactly, that wasn't his name, but he reminded me of someone named George. He was very interested in Tommy, kept offering to teach him how to throw a baseball. I didn't like that. Men who show too much interest in young boys, well, you understand why a mother would be concerned." Her hand moved to her pocket, and I could see the outline of something long and thin through the fabric. "Then there was that Paul fellow, always coming around to check the air conditioning even when I didn't call. And that college boy so pushy, wouldn't take no for an answer. Kept insisting every house needs an alarm system. They all thought they knew better than a mother what her son needed." Duke suddenly lunged forward, barking viciously at something behind Lorraine, and in that moment of chaos I saw into their living room. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all of Tommy at different ages. But in every single photo where there should have been other people, birthday parties, school events, sports teams, the other faces had been cut out, leaving these jagged holes around Tommy's smiling face. Some of the photos had words written across them in red marker: dangerous, threat eliminated, protected. On the coffee table I could see what looked like a scrapbook, and sticking out from its pages were driver's licenses, several of them, fanned out like playing cards. Lorraine noticed where I was looking and smiled, this horrible stretched thing that showed too many teeth. "A mother keeps souvenirs," she said softly, "to remember all the times she kept her baby safe. You seem like a nice man, living alone, no interest in children. That's good. The last man who lived in your house, he had a nephew who would visit. Young boy, about Tommy's age. They'd play basketball in the driveway. Tommy would watch from his window and cry because he wanted a friend so badly. But friends can hurt you. Friends can turn mean. Friends can make you trust them, and then… She trailed off, her fingers drumming against whatever was in her pocket. I backed away slowly, keeping Duke's leash tight, my mind racing with the realization that I was standing 3 feet from a serial killer who was essentially confessing to my face. Tommy had disappeared deeper into the house, but I could hear him crying somewhere upstairs, these muffled sobs that sounded like they were being smothered by a pillow. I should go, I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. Early meeting tomorrow. Lorraine nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact. Yes, you should go, and maybe you should think about moving. This neighborhood isn't for everyone. Sometimes people who stay too long, they start to seem like threats. They get too comfortable, too nosy. They dig up things that should stay buried. And then a mother has to make hard choices. She pulled her hand from her pocket, and I saw she was holding a box cutter, the blade retracted but her thumb on the slider. Tommy's all I have. He's such a sensitive boy. The world is so cruel to sensitive boys. But don't worry about us. I've handled everything before, and I'll handle everything again if I need to. The message was crystal clear. Leave or become another one of those driver's licenses in her scrapbook. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my living room with every light on, Duke pressed against my legs, trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't just call the cops without solid evidence. What I had could be explained away, and Lorraine would know I'd turned on her. But I also couldn't leave those families wondering forever what happened to their loved ones. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement in my backyard. Through a crack in the blinds, I watched Lorraine digging near the fence line with a garden spade, her movements frantic and desperate. She was trying to find what Duke had uncovered, probably to move it somewhere else. That's when I made my decision. I took photos of everything in the plastic bin, uploaded them to 3 different cloud services, and emailed them to myself with a detailed account of everything. Then I called in an anonymous tip from a burner phone I'd bought years ago and never used, telling them exactly where to dig and what they'd find. I said I was a neighbor who'd seen someone burying something suspicious months ago, but had been too scared to call until now. Within an hour, I saw the first police car roll up with its lights off. By dawn, the entire street was blocked off with yellow tape. They found George Hoffman's remains buried deeper under where Duke had discovered his belongings. But that was just the beginning. The cadaver dogs went crazy in 3 other spots along the fence line. By noon, they'd found partial remains of Paul Brenner and Joseph Mills. Adrian Vega was under Lorraine's own garden shed, wrapped in industrial plastic and duct tape. I watched from my window as they led Lorraine out in handcuffs, her red hair wild and uncombed, screaming about protecting her son, how they were all predators, all of them wanting to hurt her baby. Tommy came out separately with a social worker, and for the first time he wasn't wearing that NASCAR jacket. He looked smaller without it, younger, like a scared kid who'd been living in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As they put him in a different car, he looked directly at my window and nodded once, just barely. And I understood then that he'd known all along what his mother was doing, but had been too terrified to stop her or tell anyone. The investigation went on for weeks. Turns out Lorraine had been doing this for even longer than anyone suspected. They found evidence linking her to 2 other disappearances from the late 90s, before Tommy was even born. She'd convinced herself that every man who came near their property was a potential predator, a threat to her son that needed to be eliminated. The psychiatrists who evaluated her said she had some extreme form of delusional disorder mixed with violent paranoia, probably triggered by something in her own past that she'd never dealt with. Tommy went to live with an aunt in Wisconsin, and I heard later he was doing better, getting therapy, trying to have a normal life for the first time. As for me and Duke, we moved out 2 weeks after the arrests. I couldn't stay there knowing what had happened in that soil under those trees. The house is still empty, last I heard. Nobody wants to live next to a killing ground. Sometimes I still dream about Lorraine at that window, watching, always watching, and I wake up checking my own windows, making sure no one's there. The thing that haunts me most is thinking about how many people she might have killed if Duke hadn't found that bundle, and how many other Lorraines might be out there, standing at their windows right now, watching their neighbors and deciding who's a threat. Mom's house still smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood polish when I moved back in. The kind of scent that clings to everything, even the clothes in your suitcase. My father's funeral had been 3 weeks earlier, but it felt like the house hadn't noticed. Everything was too neat, too staged, like she was keeping it frozen in time. She said having me back would make things feel normal again. But the moment I stepped into my old room, I knew normal wasn't coming back. The wallpaper had changed, pale blue now, but the faint square outline above the dresser was still there, where a family photo used to hang. That missing frame kept bothering me. I remembered it clearly. The 4 of us at Lake Winona, my dad holding the fishing rod, my mom with that giant straw hat, and me covered in mosquito bites. I asked her where it went and she laughed, saying there was never a photo like that. I thought she was joking until she started getting defensive. "You must be mixing it up with one from your aunt's cabin," she said, and moved on like nothing happened. That night I checked the hallway wall, the family portraits, and noticed more empty spaces where pictures had been. Over the next few days, things shifted in small ways. The living room furniture rearranged itself overnight. The sofa that had always been against the far wall was suddenly in front of the window. Mom claimed she just wanted more light in the mornings, but even the rug had changed positions. When I mentioned it, she insisted it had always been that way, her tone calm but firm, like she was rehearsing a line. She started correcting me on small things too. The color of my childhood bike, the name of my 4th grade teacher, as if she was rewriting my own memories. The real unease began one morning when I went to the attic. I'd been searching for some of Dad's old tools to fix the leaky sink. In a dusty box marked VHS, I found a home movie labeled 1998 Birthday. I didn't even own a VCR anymore, but Mom still had one hooked up in the guest room. I pressed play and watched myself as a kid sitting beside my father, blowing out candles. The camera panned, catching Mom clapping, and behind her, on the wall, was that missing frame. Same photo, clear as day. When I showed the tape to Mom later that day, she barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "That's not real," she said, almost bored. I laughed, thinking she meant the date was wrong, but she doubled down. "You've been through a lot lately," she continued, her voice soft, like she was talking to a patient. "Your mind plays tricks when you're grieving." I tried explaining that it wasn't grief, that the video literally showed the photo she claimed never existed, but she just smiled and turned off the TV. The screen went black, reflecting my face and hers behind me, standing too close. That night I couldn't sleep. The house made its old noises, pipes expanding, the clock ticking, but there was something new, faint and rhythmic, like someone flipping through photo albums in another room. Around midnight, I went to the living room and saw the gallery wall again. All the frames were there now, perfectly aligned, but every photo was the same, me and Mom, no Dad. Even ones I remembered of the 3 of us fishing or decorating the Christmas tree. He was just gone, like he'd never existed in the frame. My heart started racing, and before I could process it, I heard her footsteps behind me. She acted surprised when I asked her about the photos. "Honey, they've always looked like this," she said, and I could tell she believed it. Her voice was calm, steady, almost rehearsed. Then she added, "You've been spending too much time in that attic. Maybe it's not good for you to stay up there alone." The way she said alone sent a chill through me, like it carried another meaning. I didn't respond. I just went back to my room and locked the door for the first time since moving in. The next morning, my aunt called out of nowhere, asking if I was doing okay. She mentioned Mom had told her I was remembering things wrong and getting obsessive. I could hear the hesitation in her tone, like she didn't fully believe Mom but didn't want to challenge her either. I tried explaining, but she kept repeating, "Maybe give it some time." When I hung up, I realized Mom had started turning everyone against me: family, neighbors, even her church friends. The narrative had already been written, and I was the unstable son who couldn't handle his father's death. 2 days later, I found the tape missing from my nightstand drawer. I tore the room apart, even checked the trash bins, but it was gone. When I asked Mom, she just stared at me like I'd said something absurd. "You really need to rest," she whispered. That night, while pretending to sleep, I heard the faint buzz of the VCR in the guest room. Through the crack in the door, I saw her sitting there in the dark, watching static. The TV flickered white and gray, the screen glowing on her face as she whispered something I couldn't make out. I didn't stay to listen. I locked myself in my room again and jammed a chair under the knob. The following morning, every trace of my father was gone. His clothes, his fishing rods, even the dent in his recliner cushion, all replaced, erased, or neatly rearranged. I checked the attic again, but the VHS box had vanished too. It felt like the house itself was being rewritten, one memory at a time. I started taking photos on my phone to prove things were changing, but the images wouldn't match what I saw later. The chair that had moved was back in place, the empty shelf was suddenly full again. Even the photo I took of the wall where the frame once hung appeared normal. No discoloration, no outline. I decided to leave that night. I packed my things quietly, waiting for her to fall asleep. But as I reached the front door, I noticed a new frame hanging where the missing one used to be. It was me, standing alone in the living room, wearing the same clothes I had on that moment. The photo looked freshly printed. I didn't remember taking it, but there it was, perfectly centered and labeled in neat handwriting. My son, home again. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Behind me, her voice came softly from the hallway. "Don't go, honey, you belong here now." I moved out the next morning before she woke up. I haven't spoken to her since, though sometimes I still get calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's silence, then a faint clicking sound like an old camera flash recharging. A few weeks ago, a padded envelope showed up at my apartment. Inside was a photo in a new wooden frame. It was my living room, but through the window reflection I could see her standing outside, smiling at the lens. The drive back to my mother's place felt heavier than it should have. She'd had knee surgery 2 weeks before, and since my brother couldn't take time off work, it was on me to stay with her for a while. I expected to find the house messy. She always overdid things and ignored doctor's orders. But when I stepped through the front door, the first thing that hit me wasn't the quiet or the sight of her cane leaning by the stairs. It was the sharp sting in my nose. The air reeked of bleach, like someone had mopped every surface 10 times over. My mother, Ellen, sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, her leg propped up, smiling like everything was perfectly normal. But the living room looked nothing like the one I grew up in. Plastic covered the couch, the armchairs, even the lampshades. The carpet was gone, replaced with tile that didn't match the walls. I remember asking if she'd hired cleaners, and she just said, "Had to. The old floor was filthy." Her tone was clipped, almost defensive, and the way her eyes darted toward the hallway made me uneasy. The smell got worse the longer I stayed inside. My throat burned when I talked. Every room looked like it had been scrubbed to death. In the kitchen, there were streaks on the walls where bleach had eaten through the paint, leaving pale scars across the surface. She'd wrapped the refrigerator handle in clear plastic too, sealing it with tape. When I tried to help her make lunch, she flinched each time I touched something, like I was undoing her work. "Please, honey," she kept saying, "just let things stay clean." That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum of the air purifier in the hallway was constant, but underneath it, I swore I heard something else, a faint clicking, like water dripping onto metal. When I went downstairs, the kitchen lights were off, yet a single bulb flickered above the sink. I noticed a patch near the baseboard that looked newer than the rest of the wall, smoother, slightly brighter. Someone had painted over it recently. The edges were uneven, like whoever did it was in a hurry. By morning, the house smelled even stronger. It clung to my hair and clothes no matter how many windows I opened. Mom scolded me when she saw the curtains pulled back, saying the dust from outside would undo all her progress. I noticed her hands were cracked and raw, small cuts along her knuckles from constant scrubbing. When I suggested she take it easy, she snapped. A short, sharp sound that didn't sound like her. Then, just as quickly, she apologized and asked me to fetch the mail. Her voice trembled slightly, like she was scared I'd stay inside too long. Outside, I saw that the backyard looked different. The flower bed where she used to grow lilacs was gone, replaced by a rectangle of smooth gray cement. It didn't match the rest of the yard, and the edges looked freshly poured. I crouched to touch it and noticed faint impressions, not footprints exactly, but uneven shapes pressed into the surface before it dried. When I asked her about it later, she said the old soil was contaminated with mold. She said it like she'd practiced the line. That evening I caught her in the laundry room, wiping the washing machine door with a rag soaked in something clear. The room was humid and chemical, the floor slick. There was a stack of plastic bins behind her, all sealed tight, each labeled with dates in black marker. None of them were more than a few months old. I asked what was in them, and she said, old linens. But one of the bins was heavier than the others, and when I brushed against it, something inside shifted with a dull, wet sound. I started checking the house more carefully after that. The bathroom tiles near the bathtub were new, and the grout lines were too white, too precise. The basement door was locked, and when I asked for the key, she said it had flooded a while ago, that it was unsafe to go down there. But I'd been here over the holidays and there hadn't been any flood. Her explanations were piling up like the plastic layers on her furniture. Neat, sealed, and unnatural. That night, I waited until she fell asleep. The house was so clean it almost glowed under the dim hallway light, every reflection sharp like glass. I found the key to the basement tucked behind the spice rack. When I turned it in the lock, a faint chemical odor drifted up. The steps creaked under my feet, but the sound was muted by something. Layers of tarp, maybe. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and the deeper I went, the more I realized the space didn't smell like bleach anymore. It smelled like something trying to cover rot. There were sheets of plastic hanging from the ceiling like curtains, dividing the room into sections. In one corner stood a large metal drum with streaks running down its side, pale stains that didn't match rust. I touched the concrete floor and felt a faint vibration, like a generator humming nearby, but I couldn't see anything that explained it. The plastic rustled behind me, and for a second, I thought I heard movement. I turned toward the noise, but all I saw was the outline of another tarp swaying. When I came back upstairs, my mother was awake, standing by the sink with her hands trembling against the counter. She didn't ask where I'd been. She just said quietly, "I told you not to go down there." Her voice cracked on the last word. Then she looked at me with this distant expression, like she wasn't seeing me at all. I noticed a dark stain on her sleeve, faint but still wet. She followed my eyes, rolled the sleeve down and whispered, "I couldn't let it spread." The next morning she asked me to leave. No argument, no explanation, just said she needed a few days alone. When I came back a week later, the house was empty. Furniture gone, windows taped, walls stripped to primer. The neighbors said a moving truck came in the night. I tried calling, but her number was disconnected. The only thing left was that same chemical smell, faint but still clinging to the air, like it had soaked into the foundation itself.